Uh, we'll transition to the contemporary Jewish controversies class. Subject tonight is Who is a Jew? And again, there's a lot of material. I don't know that we'll cover it in an hour. I hope that we will. And also in looking at the calendar, we will not meet 2 weeks from tonight because it's Purim. Um, and so, tonight may be Purim Torah or not Purim Torah, but next week, 2 weeks, it's definitely Purim. So we won't have a class. And I have to say that my interest, I mean, obviously, look, if you're a rabbi, it's a subject of interest all the time because every now and then you are called to adjudicate the question of, is this person a Jew or not a Jew, and for what purpose? But I recognize that the rest of you are not rabbis, and therefore it may seem less pressing. But my interest in teaching this class was piqued by a few things. One is a lot of articles about John Ossoff and his Jewish journey and his Jewish identity, and other articles saying, and we'll get into that, what do you mean he's not even Jewish? Now, I don't know if any of you have seen any of that, but it's out there. And similarly, articles about Ella Emhoff, who's so cool and what everything, and there was an article about like all the cool Jews at the inauguration, and they wanted to interview her, and her publicist said, with all due respect, she's not going to do this interview with a Jewish publication because she's not Jewish. Okay, so we'll look into that. But also because I have been working with a young man from Germantown who graduated. I don't want to tell you like where he went to school because some of you may even know him or your kids may know him or whatever, but a young man from Germantown who played Division I basketball, graduated college last year, was a pretty good player. Was actually player of the year in the league in which his school plays, and he received an offer to play professional basketball in Israel. But that offer was contingent upon him being able to document the fact that he is Jewish. Why? Because in the Israeli Basketball League, every team is allowed to have only two non-Israeli players. But American Jews who are recruited to play basketball, or Jews from elsewhere, but it's mostly American Jews, you can make aliyah, gain citizenship immediately, and then you are not counted against the quota of non-Israeli players. So the team wanted him. They already have two non-Israeli players on their team. He is presumably good enough to play for them, but not so good that they would release one of the other non-Israeli players in order to give him a spot on the team. So I have been trying to help him establish his Jewish identity, and it has introduced me to the seamy underside of Israeli bureaucracy, and suffice to say that the young man is still in Germantown. Whether he will ever wind up in a fula or not, I cannot tell you. He can't now because the country's locked down, but aside from that, so it's kind of an interesting bureaucratic journey. So I have a lot of texts, most of them contemporary, one of them classical. And so I want to start off with a text from a Mishnah, because I think it was the sports writer, I forget who said it, right? But he said it's not what he don't know, it's what he does know that just ain't so. And one of the things that everybody knows about Judaism is that in Judaism, a baby follows the status of its mother, right? We all know that, right? Yes?
Well, yeah.
Raise your hand if you think that's true. A baby status follows the status of its mother.
Except if you're reformed.
Hold that. Okay. Everybody put your hands down because it's not so. Okay, it's not so, and I'll show you. So here is a text from the Mishnah Kiddushin 3:12. This is a complicated text, and the translation is not that great. So I'm not going to like even translate it word for word. I'll just sort of run through it really quickly. Okay, but whenever there's a valid betrothal and no sin, the child follows the male in terms of status, right? In other words, and you actually all know this, right? If your father is a Kohen and your mother is Jewish, what are you? You're a Kohen, right? If your father is a Levi and your mother is Jewish, you're a Levi. If your mother is a Bat Kohen, but your father is a Yisrael, you're a Yisrael. So actually, in a normative marriage, which the Mishnah assumes the overwhelming majority of marriages are, the child actually follows the status of the father, right? In a marriage that's like not at issue at all, the child follows the status of the father, and we actually know that. We just don't realize that that's what's going on. Okay, now if there is it says yesh kiddushin v'yesh avera, means it's a valid marriage, but there's a transgression. Okay, in rabbinic jargon, we tend to call this a prohibited but valid marriage. Okay, what does that mean? It means that ab initio, you're not supposed to get married, but if you do, it's a valid marriage. Okay, now what would be an example of a prohibited but valid marriage? Okay, I'll give you an example. I will tell you that according to the rules of Orthodox Judaism, your rabbi is in a prohibited but valid marriage, right? Because I am a Kohen, my wife is a convert. A Kohen is not allowed to marry a convert. Nevertheless, if they do, it's a valid marriage. Okay, so in that case, the child follows the status of the defect. In other words, if Kelly and I would have had biological children of our own, if we had a biological son of our own, that son would not be a Kohen. Okay, it would actually be a halal. I don't have to get into it, but that son would not be a Kohen because it's a valid but nevertheless prohibited marriage. Okay, so the son would not be a Kohen. Now, the third type of marriage is where Kiddushin, and you know what Kiddushin is. Kiddushin is like a Jewishly valid marriage, where the woman has the possibility of Kiddushin, but not with the person that she actually had the child with, okay? Then the child is a mamzer, okay, which is not exactly hard, is not exactly easy to translate. Okay, what's an example of a situation where the woman has the possibility of kiddushin, but not with the person that she had the baby with. An example would be incest, right? I mean, I don't have a sister, right? But God, if I had a sister and God forbid I fathered a child with her, right? I can't legally marry my sister, right? There's no kiddushin between me and my sister. But she could have kiddushin with pretty much any other Jew in the world, right? Just not with me, right? So in that case, the child is a mamzer, not exactly illegitimate, because like in common law, illegitimate is like two unmarried people, whereas in Judaism, two unmarried people who could marry each other, it's perfectly legitimate child. It's not a mamzer. Okay, and then the fourth situation is where the woman has no possibility of kiddushin at all, meaning essentially a Gentile, right? So if the father is a Jew and the mother is a Gentile, then the child is a Gentile, okay? And conversely, if the mother is Jewish and the father is Gentile, the child is Jewish. Okay, so that's where we get this idea that the child follows its mother's status, but actually it's not so. I mean, I recognize that I ran through that quite quickly, but are there any questions or comments about that specific material? Anyone? Yes, Sue.
I'm sorry. Could you just repeat that last one? If a Jewish woman marries someone who is not Jewish?
Right. So then all right. Well, I mean, marry somebody who's not Jewish is halachically a misnomer, right? There basically kiddushin, which I'll call Jewishly valid marriage, exists only between two Jews, right? But if essentially, and I recognize that this can be offensive, especially to people who are involved in intermarriage, and it's not my intention to be offensive. Okay, I'm describing dry legal material that is sometimes not so dry if it affects you, right? There is no such thing in halacha as a marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew, right? So that the child of a Jewish woman and a non-Jewish man is legally fatherless, and being fatherless follows the status of the mother. Okay, that's essentially what it means. Okay, yeah, Barnaby.
I don't want to open a whole can of worms, but I think I think in this day, at least publicly, I think the biggest implication of mamzerut is agunot, because a woman who never got a get,
right,
can't have kiddushin with anyone else.
Right, exactly. Okay, so a mamzer is a Jew, but can't marry a kosher Jew. They can only marry another mamzer or a convert, and that is the product of a prohibited marriage. Like Barnaby says, an aguna. An aguna is a woman who's not living with her husband, but has not been given a Jewish divorce for various reasons, ranging from the husband just being a jerk and refusing to give one, to somebody who's disappeared. There is no such thing as legal death in Jewish law, as opposed to common law, right? So a married man who disappears, his wife is still married to him, and if she has a relationship with any other man, that's an adulterous relationship. That's one of the reasons why we're very, very careful. I mean, any conservative rabbi has, encountered situations where in particular where a woman is civilly divorced but has not received a get from her husband and doesn't want to go through all the hassle, you absolutely may not officiate at that marriage under any circumstances, because you're creating an adulterous relationship. And if the woman is of childbearing age, could create a situation where there's a mamzer who halachically, that's really kind of a mess. All right. Anything else on this particular material? All right. If not, we shall go on. All right. So the law of return, okay? You're all familiar with the law of return, right? It's one of the first laws that was ever passed by the state of Israel. It was passed in 1950, which essentially gives to any Jew the right to immigrate to Israel and become a citizen. Right now, you might think that that was simple, right? But it's not so simple, because this is where who is a Jew starts to come into play. The first case that brought this up was the case of Brother Daniel. Okay, Brother Daniel. Brother Daniel was a Polish Jew by the name of Oswald Rufeisen, who was hid in a monastery during the Holocaust. Not uncommon. Lots of Jewish children were hidden in monasteries, convents, etc. He was hidden in a monastery, eventually became a Catholic and became a monk, but still considered himself to be a Jew. So sometime in, I think, the early 1960s, this Carmelite monk, right? And he joined the Carmelites. The mother house of the Carmelite order is on Mount Carmel in Haifa. So he got himself transferred to the mother house of the Carmelite order, gets on a boat, shows up in Haifa port, dressed in his Carmelite habit, shows up and says, "I'm a Jew, give me my citizenship," right? And so, naturally, the immigration clerk was somewhat taken aback. But here's the question: is Brother Daniel a Jew or not? What do you think?
Yes,
Yes. Why?
because you don't stop. If you're born a Jew, you stay one.
Right. Once a Jew, always a Jew, right? You cannot stop. Halachically, you cannot cease to be a Jew.
But
right. One of my teachers once said it's kind of like the mafia.
Yeah.
You join, but you can't quit.
But I thought you once taught that if you sign on to Christianity, at the very least, you're an apostate, which would be the reason you could be considered not a Jew. And in his case, it's pretty obvious.
Well, but apostate is still a Jew. You can't be an apostate from something that you don't belong to.
But it doesn't stop.
Right? I mean, a Democrat who votes to convict Trump is not an apostate, right? A Republican who votes to convict Trump is an apostate, right? An apostate is like a heretic. You can only commit to. So you are still a Jew, because being a Jew gives you privileges, but it also gives you obligations, right? So we would not say that Oswald Rufeisen, among all the Jews in the world, Oswald Rufeisen is the only one for whom it's fine to eat pork. No, from the perspective of halacha, he's still a Jew. He still has to keep kosher. He still has to keep Shabbos. He still has to put on tefillin, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, would we penalize him? We would, right? In other words, if somebody showed up, God willing, we'll be back in the shul one day, and a monk shows up in his monastic habit and says, I have a yortzeit today. Can I have an aliyah? No. Okay, we won't give you an aliyah because we're penalizing you for having joined another religion. But it doesn't mean that halakhically you're not a Jew, right? I mean, so this is complicated stuff. However, right, there was naturally not a strong desire on the part of the state of Israel to give Brother Daniel citizenship as a Jew, right? And so it went all the way to the Israeli Supreme Court, and the Israeli Supreme Court said basically, yes, halachically, Brother Daniel is a Jew. However, Israel's not a halachic state. Israel's not a halachic state, and the term Jew, as understood by most Jews, doesn't include monks. All right, but the law likes precision, right? So, I mean, there is the reasonable man standard, but the law prefers precision, right? And so in 1970, the law of return was amended, okay? And there were basically two amendments. One is the rights of members of family, because you also had people showing up, particularly from the Eastern Bloc, who were essentially persecuted as Jews, but halachically were not Jews, right? And so they amended it to say that the rights of a Jew under this law and the rights of an Oleh, meaning a Jewish immigrant to Israel under the nationality law, as well as the rights of an Oleh under any other enactment, are also vested in a child and a grandchild of a Jew, the spouse of a Jew, the spouse of a child of a Jew, and the spouse of a grandchild of a Jew, except for a person who has been a Jew and has voluntarily changed his religion, right? In other words, I mean, that's a wordy way of saying that you may not be halachically a Jew, but we're not going to say, you can make Aliyah, but you can't bring your spouse, right? You can make Aliyah, but you can't bring your children, right? You're Jewish enough for the Nazis to have thrown you in a concentration camp, but not Jewish enough to come live in Israel. Right, so this definition is the mirror image of the Nuremberg definition, which basically said a grandchild of a Jew is Jewish enough for us to kill them. Right, so Israel says a grandchild of a Jew is Jewish enough for us to give them sanctuary. Doesn't mean we'll necessarily recognize you as a Jew.
True.
Right, and this is why you have a situation now, of probably 1 million Olim from the former Soviet Union who have Jewish connections, but are many of them halachically not Jewish, right? Because they had a Jewish father or a Jewish grandfather or whatever. And that is the case with this young man who I'm trying to help him make Aliyah for the purposes of playing basketball in a Fula. Okay, that he claims that his grandmother was Jewish. Okay, there was a fire in the house. They don't have any records. His grandmother was Jewish, not his grandfather. Okay, so his mother says, yes, we celebrated Hanukkah when I was a kid. We went sometimes to our relatives for Passover. We never celebrated Christmas, but that's the extent of it. There's no documentation whatsoever. So the state of Israel, not unreasonably says exactly this. There's no documentation whatsoever. How do we know he's not lying? And my answer is, you don't know he's not lying. So I'll get to you in a second. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if this young man showed up in shul and said, I'm Jewish, we would count him for the minyan. We would give him an aliyah. If he wanted me to officiate at his wedding to another Jewish person, I would need more documentation, right? So, basically I said, because I started as a Hillel rabbi, right? And I used to have to write letters for kids all the time. And I said, I'll write you any letter you want as long as it's true. Right? The classic example was a Jewish kid who wanted to go to his best friend's wedding on Saturday and wanted to therefore take the LSATs on Sunday. Now, there is no provision to take the LSAT on Sunday because you're going to a wedding. But here's what I wrote. I wrote, so-and-so is Jewish. The Jewish Sabbath is Saturday. He wants to take the LSAT on Sunday. All of those statements were true.
They're true.
Right? I never said that the kid observed Shabbat or that the reason he wanted to, but, I read it. So I said, so-and-so has told me this. I spoke to his mom. She confirms it. I have no reason to believe that it's not so, which is true. And then I said, now it's in the state of Israel. Now, frankly, I'm in a little bit of hot water about it, but as far as I'm concerned, truth is an absolute defense. I never said he was Jewish. I said he told me he is, and I don't have any reason to believe he's lying. But it's not good enough for the state of Israel, and perhaps not surprisingly so. Now, Sue, I know you had a question or a comment.
I was just wondering, do they ever do DNA testing to find out if in fact he has, and if so, what would the percentage be?
No, DNA testing has no halachic validity. Because there's conversion, there's apostasy, there's no, it's not. Now, having said that, I mean, I had my DNA and I'm 99.2% Ashkenazi Jewish. I forget what the other 8% is sort of random Eastern European. Not surprising, but there's no validity because, people can have Jewish ancestry and not be halachically Jewish. And all this would prove is that you have Jewish ancestry somewhere. Right. So, so that was the First Amendment to the law of return, was to give the right to make aliyah to children or grandchildren or spouses of Jews who are not themselves halachically Jewish. All right. Now, the Second Amendment is, what's the definition of Jew, right? And so, for the purposes of this law, Jew means a person who was born of a Jewish mother or has become converted to Judaism and who is not a member of another religion, right? So a Jew is somebody born to a Jewish mother, somebody converted to Judaism, and is not a member of another religion, right? So brother Daniel is now out because he was born of a Jewish mother, but he is a member of another religion, right? Now, this being so, why do we on a routine basis have these who is a Jew crises anyway? Why? If it says a Jew is somebody born of a Jewish mother or who has converted. Gail.
In this case, it's who did the conversion.
Right. Exactly. Right. The law of return does not define what is a valid conversion. Right. And purposely so. That's creative ambiguity. Right. So, from the Orthodox perspective, right, somebody who converted under my auspices is most likely not a Jew. But again, there's a difference between who is a Jew for purposes of citizenship and who is a Jew for purposes of marriage, because marriage is in the hands of the Orthodox chief rabbinate. And the fact that I wrote a letter that's been accepted, right, to document somebody's Jewish status for purposes of citizenship doesn't mean that the rabbinate in Israel will accept them as Jewish and allow them to get married. But they're two different issues, right? So every once in a while, and by the way, the organization that historically has pushed the hardest to exclude non-Orthodox conversions has been Chabad. Okay, I know so many Reform and conservative Jews love Chabad because they're so nice and so authentic and so warm and fuzzy. But let me tell you, if you have converts in your family, you should think twice about idolizing Chabad because they want to write your converted relatives out of the Jewish community. Yeah, Gail.
So it's kind of interesting. Based on that, my son David, who's now become Eastern Orthodox, could not go to Israel as a citizen, whereas my Christian future daughter-in-law, since her grandfather was Jewish, could.
Right. I mean, the exclusion is specifically, it's not somebody who practices a non-Jewish religion. It's somebody who was Jewish and now practices a non-Jewish religion. Okay, so that's exactly right. That David would not be eligible, but a Christian with a Jewish grandparent would be, because they didn't leave Judaism for another religion. They were never Jewish to begin with, but they have Jewish ancestry and therefore qualifying to, appropriately so, I think. I mean, again, if the Nazis want to kill you because you're a Jew, Israel should be willing to give you refuge. To me, that doesn't seem very, controversial, but it does lead to certainly anomalous situations. It also leads to questions about, because even like there was a case a few years ago of a family of Jews for Jesus who wanted to make Aliyah, and they said, but we're not members of a non-Jewish religion. We're Jews who believe in Jesus, right? We're not Christians, we're Jews who believe for Jesus. And the Israeli Supreme Court, again, correctly, in my opinion, said, nah, you practice another religion, right? You practice another religion, and therefore you do not qualify to make Aliyah under the law of return. We're not saying that halachically you're not Jewish, but you don't qualify under the law of return. All right. Any questions or comments on this? Yeah, Toby, need to unmute.
Suppose somebody did turn to another religion, but really deep down wanted to resume his Judaism. Could they be converted? Would that?
Right. Okay. No, I get your question. I mean, and it's not uncommon, right? A Jew joins another religion and then wants to come back. Again, once a Jew, always a Jew. Therefore, there's no conversion. But there is a ceremony called Divrei Chaverut, where you appear before a Beit Din, you renounce your prior religion, you know, sort of formally say sorry, and then you would be reaccepted as part of the Jewish community. So there, you know, what it'd be an interesting question. I've never dealt with that in terms of like the law of return, so I don't know, you know, what kind of documentation would be, but there is certainly such a thing as, you know, renouncing your apostasy and proclaiming. By the way, I mean, Judaism is not unique in this regard. I mean, you know, Kelly is a baptized Roman Catholic. And as far as canon law is concerned, she is an apostate Catholic. You know, big deal, right? But you know, it made for some interesting discussions. You know, with a good friend of mine who's the abbot of a Trappist monastery, who is, you know, as far as, you know, he loves her and he thinks she's wonderful, but she's as in his eyes, she's an apostate Catholic. You know, what are you going to do? All right, so let's go on. All right, so in 1983, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which is the Association of Reform Rabbis, and when we discussed this, and I said, you know, it goes after the father unless it's you know, a problem, and somebody said, except for the reform, right? I don't remember who said that. Mike, okay. Yes and no, okay, because what the CCAR actually said is often misunderstood. I'm not going to read the whole document because, as anticipated, this is taking longer than I thought it would. But essentially what they're saying, they're making a sociological observation that which I think is incontrovertible, that the religion of your parents is not necessarily determinative of how you will view yourself, right? That is to say, you could have a Jewish mother and still not view yourself as a Jew. You could have a Jewish father and view yourself as a Jew. Furthermore, most children who are the product of mixed marriages have, you know, ongoing relationships with both sides of the family, right? And I think this is, you know, incontrovertibly true. I would say throughout my career as a conservative rabbi, I would say certainly a clear majority of the kids in the Hebrew schools of the 3 conservative congregations that I've served have non-Jewish grandparents, right? Either they are a product of a marriage between a born Jew and a converted Jew, or a born Jew and a non-Jew. But in either case, you know, their extended non-Jewish family is still part of their family. I mean, and the same goes for me. I mean, when Kelly's aunt died a few years after we got married, but when Kelly's aunt Norma was still alive, we would go to Louisville and go to her family's Christmas party, and I don't have a problem with it, and never did have a problem with it. So I'm going to look at, you know, towards sort of the middle, the last paragraph before the therefore. This leads us to the conclusion that the same requirements must be applied to establish the status of a child of a mixed marriage, regardless of whether the mother or the father is Jewish. Therefore, the Central Conference of American Rabbis declares that the child of one Jewish parent is under the presumption of Jewish descent. This presumption of the Jewish status of the offspring of any mixed marriage is to be established through appropriate and timely public and formal acts of identification with the Jewish faith and people. The performance of these mitzvot serves to commit those who participate in them, both parent and child, to Jewish life. Depending on circumstances, mitzvot leading toward a positive and exclusive Jewish identity will include entry into the covenant, that is to say, a bris or a baby naming or something like that, acquisition of a Hebrew name, Torah study, bar bat mitzvah, and Kabbalat Torah, or confirmation. For those beyond childhood claiming Jewish identity, other public acts or declarations may be added or substituted after consultation with their rabbi. Now, I will tell you that my lawyer friends say that the next to last paragraph is completely unintelligible, right? Presumption of Jewish descent, which is established through appropriate and time, right? It doesn't really mean anything. I don't know how you establish a presumption, right? I mean, presumption either is or it isn't, right? So first of all, yeah, Alan.
With a presumption gives you the right to rebut it. So
Right.
if there's a presumption that I'm drunk merely because I blew a 2.0 on a test, and I can bring in doctors saying, well, I'm 2.0 all the time. There are presumptions that are rebuttable and presumptions that are not. And I'm sorry to get into the weeds on that, but I think that's what they're talking about.
Right. But there's not a presumption that's established, right? A presumption is assumed to be true unless rebutted. You don't have to establish a presumption. You have to refute or rebut a presumption, right? But so what has been understood and what this actually said are not the same thing, right? Most people, to my knowledge, Reform or otherwise, think that Reform Judaism says if either parent is Jewish, you're Jewish. And that's not what it says. It says if either parent is Jewish and you are essentially raised as a Jew and identify exclusively as a Jew, you are Jewish. Okay, so therefore, this phenomenon that is increasingly common of, we'll have a Christmas tree and a menorah. We'll do Passover and Easter. On the first and third Sundays, the kid will go to catechism, and on the second and fourth Sundays, they'll go to Hebrew school. We'll have a brisening for our kids. Right? We'll have a rabbi and a priest, and according to the letter of this resolution, such a child is not Jewish because they do not have an exclusive Jewish identity. You also have now, in theory, a situation where somebody could be Jewish according to conservative and Orthodox understanding, but not according to Reform, right? In other words, you have a Jewish mother, right? But you are not raised with any religion, okay? I mean, let's take my nieces, okay? Now, in this case, it's the reverse, right? I mean, because my brother is Jewish, my sister-in-law is not, but they've been raised as Unitarians. But if it had been reversed, if I had a sister, right, and she was married to a non-Jewish man, and the kids were raised as Unitarians, halachically, by Orthodox and conservative standards, they would be Jews, right? But by the letter of this resolution, they would not be Jews because they were not raised as Jews and don't have an exclusive Jewish identity. Right now, in practice, most of my friends who are Reform rabbis say, look, we cannot be in a situation where we are stricter than the conservative and the Orthodox, and somebody comes to us and the conservative rabbi just said, yeah, of course you're a Jew, and now I say you're not a Jew, right? So mean, and that is a problem as far as I'm concerned. As a pulpit rabbi, any resolution that is impossible to follow in the context of an actual congregation is a bad resolution. This is the critique that many of you have heard me say of many of Rabbi Joel Roth's teshuvot, which make a lot of sense academically, but very hard to implement in real life in a congregation, right? But clearly what this is saying in theory is if either parent is Jewish and you are raised as a Jew and exclusively as a Jew, you are a Jew. If you're not raised as a Jew, or if you're raised, ambiguously or raised with both, whatever, because the word exclusive is in there. Now, how many of you understood that that was the case? Yeah, Mike, see, yeah, and Alan. Okay.
I went to a wedding where our cousin was the father of the bride.
Right.
She was raised Jewish, although her mother was not Jewish.
Right.
And the groom, the father of the groom was Jewish and the mother was not. And he was raised Jewish, and a Reformed rabbi did the wedding, which would have been impossible, I think, in conservative circumstances.
It would have been. Right. It would have been, yeah.
But it really made sense. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
Look, absolutely. It's internally consistent. So Barnaby and then Alan.
I don't know where the reform movement is currently concerned, but I know that the Reconstructionist movement had legalized patrilineality under the condition that the child be raised as Jewish. So someone with a Jewish mother who is not raised as Jewish will not be considered as Jewish under those.
Yeah,
rules.
I mean, the Reconstructionist position is essentially the same as Reform, as I understand it. But, yeah, Alan.
Yeah, Rabbi, I think it comes down, it's contextual, and it comes down to the circumstances of an individual. And I think that's all they're saying. If you have if you have some Jewish descent, if you could have been killed by the Nazis, and you follow that, but it depends on the circumstances of each case. Does going to a Christmas party disqualify you? Well, probably not. But if you do it exclusively, yeah, maybe.
Right. No, I think that that's right. And I mean, to me, that is that there's a difference between sociology and halakha, right? And so, when you're taught, and halakha, for the purposes of this discussion, will posit that halakha is a system of law, right? Law doesn't like ambiguity, right? I mean, it should be possible to look at any particular person and say, this person is or is not a Jew. Right now, different people may disagree about this person is or is not a Jew, but when it gets fuzzy and ambiguous, that becomes a problem. Having said that, sociologically, there's no question. I mean, I had when I was in Norwich, Connecticut, so there was another conservative shul about 15 miles away in New London. And one day the rabbi of that shul, who was a few years older than I am, called me up and he said, I have a problem. I had this couple in my office asking me to marry them. And I found out that the groom has a Jewish father, a non-Jewish mother, was raised Reform on Long Island, had a bar mitzvah, identifies as a Jew, blah, 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 blah. I found out that, his father's not Jew, his mother's not Jewish, rather. And I said, you're not a Jew. And they got very upset and left. And what should I do? And my answer to him was, what you need to do is go out and get yourself a time machine and not say that. Because it's a problem. I mean, in the same circumstance, I would never say you are not a Jew. I would say there is a problem with your Jewish status because your mother is not Jewish. I totally validate the fact that you were raised as a Jew, that you identify as a Jew, but legally there's a problem. Let's see if we can fix it. Now, it's entirely possible that the person will still be upset, right? I can't guarantee that, but I think it's a lot more gentle to say, I validate your self-understanding, but there's a problem that we can fix, rather than simply saying you're not Jewish. Mike.
Yeah, so we had a kid in our Hebrew school who was remarkable. He could read Torah with no preparation. He could lead services.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Okay. His mother had converted to Judaism, and he went to college, and he hooked in with the observant crowd. And so he went, and Saturday morning he was reading Torah for them. And then in a dorm session, he mentioned that his mother had converted. And it was an oops moment,
right?
Because suddenly they said, well, you can no longer read Torah for us. You can no longer daven at the Amid. Indeed, you would have to go through conversion before we could accept you as a Jew. And he chose to do that. I mean, right. I argued with him, but he chose to do that because he was thinking someday he'll want to make Aliyah. And if these kids don't accept, neither will the Orthodox.
Right. Look, I mean, there are situations now in this particular case. I mean, he really wanted to live his life as part of the Orthodox community.
Yeah.
So there were, and I know he went on to study at Ner Yisroel, not Ner Yisroel, at the Mirror Yeshiva, right? And there's no way that the Mirror Yeshiva would have accepted him if he had not had a conversion. Look, the same thing when Kelly and I got engaged. She had been Jewish for 10 years with a conservative conversion. Right. I was already living in Baltimore. I had a lot of Orthodox friends. We went to an Orthodox rabbi who I knew, and we decided that life would be easier if she had an Orthodox conversion in case we had kids of our own, and there would be no issue with their status.
So, who's talking?
And here's where that Mishnah came into play. I am.
Okay.
Here's where that Mishnah came into play, because we were not married yet. And this Orthodox rabbi said, knowing that you plan to get married, I cannot convert her. Once you are already married, I can convert her, right? Because I'm not doing a conversion in anticipation of you entering a prohibited marriage. You're already in a prohibited marriage, which was fine with us too, because I didn't want to give the impression that I thought she wasn't really Jewish, that I didn't accept the conservative conversion, right? So we got married, and then a few months after we got married, she had another Orthodox conversion. So that should, I mean, as it turned out, we didn't have kids and it wasn't such an issue, but, she converted twice because it was simply easier to do so, and without having difficult issues with our Orthodox friends. Now, we don't live as part of an Orthodox community. Obviously, we don't intend to, but if we did, she would have no issue because she also has an Orthodox conversion. Now, all right, let's move on to, I know it's 8:50. Do you guys, you want to stick this out for a few more minutes? Yeah, okay. So let's move on to John Ossoff. Okay. Ossoff clearly identifies as a Jew, right? And made a big deal about it, right? During the campaign, Ossoff and Warnock would appear together and talk about, the glory days of the Black Jewish Alliance, and talk about how the temple in Atlanta was bombed in 1958 because Rabbi Rothschild supported civil rights. And look, he was certainly Jewish enough to be victimized by anti-Semitism, right? When David Perdue ran an ad where they photoshopped a bigger nose onto him, right? And then, of course, Kelly Loeffler photoshopped Warnock to make his skin even darker than it is, right? I mean, fortunately, these appeals to anti-Semitism and racism didn't seem to work. But, the fact that there's a question about whether John Ossoff is halakhically Jewish or not certainly didn't bother anti-Semites. Who's, oh, well, maybe halakhically he's not Jewish, so we won't try to use anti-Semitism against him. Nor did it prevent him from very strongly identifying as a Jew, right? However, let's look at the next source. Okay, so this is, oh, I'm going to skip the RA standard of rabbinic practice because you already know it, right? We're not allowed to recognize patrilineal descent. We're not allowed to do a conversion that, doesn't involve all the traditional sand. But I'll skip that because you already know that. Okay, so this is an interview with John Ossoff in Moment magazine. What is your Jewish background? My father is the grandson of Jewish immigrants from Lithuania and Russia who arrived in the US in the early 20th century with nothing. My mother is an Australian immigrant who is not Jewish. So prior to my bar mitzvah, I entered the mikveh to make it official. I was raised in a Jewish household, went to the temple, which is a Reform synagogue here in Atlanta, and was bar mitzvahed, and shortly thereafter made my first trip to Israel. Okay. Now, this statement is fascinating on a million levels, right? Because
He went to a mikveh.
Huh?
No, he went to a mikveh.
He went to a mikveh, right? Now, why is that interesting? Because he shouldn't have had to go to the mikveh according to that resolution from 1983, right? I mean, his father's Jewish. He's clearly raised as a Jew, identifies as a Jew, but for whatever reason, he went to the mikveh before his bar mitzvah. Now, is that a conversion? I don't know. I mean, the fact of the matter is that if John Ossoff ever comes to our shul and wants to have an aliyah, I will give him an aliyah. I will count him in a minyan. His wife, by the way, is Jewish, right? But again, if I were asked to officiate at his wedding, I would say, you said something about going to the mikveh before your bar. What exactly was that, right? And if we could consider that a conversion, which I think was clearly the intention. In other words, there are plenty of Reform rabbis who say basically, look, you should know that although we consider you Jewish, more traditional Jews may not. And you may want to consider going through a pro forma conversion so that it will lessen the possibility. Okay, now, that would have no validity in the Orthodox community anyway, right? But we know that there's plenty of mobility between the Reform and the conservative community. And by and large, I mean, I accept a conservative conversion if it involved a trip to the mikveh for men or women, and if it involved circumcision for a male, and presumably he was already, circumcised. So that's, I think, what was going on. And I would say, call a kavod to the rabbi who did that, because I think that to the extent that there are issues, you want to minimize those issues, right? But so clearly there was a recognition that having a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother may not be sufficient to, qualify to, guarantee your Jewish identity. And so he decided to resolve that. Is your Jewish heritage important to you? It is. I think that the values were infused in my upbringing by my parents and grandparents and my synagogue. Commitment to peace and justice and kindness still inform how I approach my life every day. Can you expand on that? I think that Jews share a story that compels us to approach the world with empathy. Because our story is one of hardship, persecution, perseverance, our story is one which has required us to fight for our freedom and survival, which has required us to find those of other faiths who, with kindness and empathy, have harbored us at other times of great danger. Most Jews, no matter where they live in the world, share an immigrant story. We have been a people on the move. That heritage informs my commitment to a vision of America that is open and decent, kind and respectful. That lives up to our national character as a place that welcomes strivers from afar and those fleeing violence and persecution. Vinomar Amen, right? I mean, that I think resonates with all of us. And clearly, John Ossoff's Jewish identity is important to him. Whether he's halachically Jewish or not, he's clearly sociologically Jewish, and it's important to him. And in fact, when he was sworn in, I mentioned in 1958 how the temple was bombed. He was sworn in on the Hertz Chumash that belonged to Rabbi William Rothschild, who had been the rabbi of the temple, right? And so that was important to him. Now, on the other hand, Ella Emhoff, right? The daughter of Doug Emhoff, the spouse of the vice president, she has made it very clear that she does not identify as a Jew, right? She's had requests for interviews from different Jewish publications, and here's what she said. All right, so the editor of the Forward wanted to interview her because they put her on the list of the 50 most intriguing and influential American Jews, right? They put her on that list. And she says, we knew it'd be a long shot to get the increasingly in demand and also still enrolled in college Ella to join one of our Zoom conversations with members of the Forward 50, but when the polite decline came, the reason threw me. Ella is not Jewish, wrote Joseph David Viola, the spokesman Ella's Instagram refers queries to. This only made me more intrigued, so I asked one of our reporters, Irene Katz-Connolly, blah, blah, blah. So here's what she said. Ella's dad has been celebrating Judaism for a few years now, but out of an independent search, and that Ella was living on her own in New York during this period. It's not something she grew up with, he explained. Ella truly has no qualms with the faith, but she does not want to speak on behalf of Judaism as she does not celebrate herself. Okay, now, I also find this endlessly fascinating because, among other things, it identifies Judaism as a religion that she does not share, right? And I think most American Jews don't identify Judaism, certainly not like exclusively, as a religion, right? I mean, plenty of American Jews don't celebrate Judaism either, but still identify as Jews, right? And there is no doubt in my mind that Ella Emhoff is a participant in Jewish culture, right? I mean, her nickname for her stepmother, Kamala, is Mamala, right? That didn't come from nowhere, right? And also, I mean, and this to me is even more telling, is that there was an interview with them because for some bizarre reason, they call their mother Mom, but their father Doug. And they asked why, and she said, oh, to us, he's just regular schmegular Doug, right? And I can't imagine anybody but a Jew, and especially a New York Jew, saying regular schmegular Doug, right? I mean, that is it. So clearly, she participates to some extent in Jewish culture. She clearly has 50% Jewish ancestry, but she does not identify as a Jew. Now, John Ossoff and Ella Emhoff, right, both have a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, but have chosen two very different paths of Jewish practice and Jewish identity. And this is just a sociological reality. And so I, as a conservative rabbi, sometimes am in positions where I have to say, look, halachically, there's an issue. But as far as I'm concerned, anybody who identifies as a Jew and practices Judaism is a Jew. I mean, halachically, they may not be, right? And therefore, under certain circumstances, we may have to do something about that, depending on the circumstances, right? But we live in a society where everybody gets to choose their own identity, and that's simply a fact. I'd add one other thing is that Doug Emhoff, regular schmegular Doug, grew up in the same Reform temple that I did in New Jersey, Temple Shalom in Matawan, and is my brother's age. My brother does not remember him, even though they were in Hebrew school together. But some of my brother's friends do remember him, and so it is a connection. And I will stop. But again, questions, comments, disputations, objections, Mike.
So you at one point were going to, I think, to Nassau in the Bahamas to be the high holiday rabbi.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's a halachic thing as to who can get an aliyah or if it's self-determined and you would say, okay. But I mean, was that an issue down there for you?
Yeah, I mean, if we had more time, I could, go into it. I mean, it wasn't an issue because I was only the high holiday rabbi. But if I were the permanent rabbi, there would have been questions that I would have had to ask, right? It's also an issue when you are operating in a non-denominational or pan-denominational context, right? I mean, that congregation is not affiliated, which sometimes makes it difficult for conservative rabbis who are serving congregations that are not conservative affiliated. But just, in that situation, right? So I didn't even have time to mention this, right? But I'll mention it now. I did actually talk about it in my talk after I got back, because I went down there to do a bar mitzvah, right? Was a kid who had a Jewish father, not a Jewish mother. He was born shortly before my last high holidays there. So I supervised his circumcision. And 13 years later, I was asked to come back for his bar mitzvah, but he had never finished the conversion, right? So finding a mikveh is not an issue because the ocean is a mikveh, right? But finding a beit din, you have, right? So the plan was to get down there, finish the conversion on Thursday, then do the bar mitzvah on Shabbos, right? But putting together a Beit Din became complicated for a few reasons. One is that it's August, and anybody who lives in Nassau who can afford to leaves Nassau in August. You don't want to be in Nassau in August. The other thing is that subsequent to the time that I was there, Chabad showed up, and most of the white Jews now go to Chabad. Most of the Jews of color still go to the original congregation. So it was hard for me to find two other Jewish males whose Jewish status was not in question, because one of them said, I would do it, but I can't do it because the Chabad rabbi will be mad at me, and I don't want to piss him off, which I understand because I don't live there. He does, whatever, right? So it became a real issue. Now, here's where it gets fun. Okay, on Paradise Island is the Shivananda Yoga Ashram. Almost all of the swamis at the Shivananda Ashram are Israeli. All of them. I mean, if you watch, I occasionally watch their Zoom videos of their lectures. Inevitably, I just look at the guy and I know when he opens his mouth, it's going to be in the sutras that we are reading tonight, it says that, and they're Kulam Yisraelim. They're all Israelis, right? So the father suggested that I get two of the swamis from the ashram to be on the Beit Din with me. And, so I spent significant amount of time speaking to Jews who know this place to figure out whether they're apostates or not. I mean, they certainly identify as Jews. If you ask them, are you Jewish? They'll say, absolutely. I am a Jew who practices Shivananda yoga, right? Absolutely. Question is, because an apostate can't be on a Beit Din. Now, as it turned out, I didn't have to go that route. I did find two other Jews to be on a Beit Din with, but it's a fascinating, the whole question of identity in the contemporary world is just endlessly fascinating because, up until 2-3 generations ago, you were born into a certain slot and you lived in that slot willy-nilly. And it's just not so anymore. We all decide who we are. Yeah, Barnaby.
I know we've been talking mostly about, we mostly talking about patrilineals tonight, but and this particularly applies to Gail's children. We're talking about matrilineals and why even though there's a halachic, presumption that they're Jewish, why must there also necessarily be a sociological presumption that they must be Jewish, and why can't we respect their decision to identify with their father's cultures, and B, not identify Jewish at all?
Right. No, look, I think sociologically you're absolutely correct, right? For me, the bottom line is that, and I tell people this in various contexts, right? I, as a conservative rabbi, cannot give you permission to do something that the halacha says you can't do, right? So if somebody comes to me and they have a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, and they say, I don't consider myself Jewish, fine, you don't consider yourself Jewish, all right? And the halacha does. So what? I'm not gonna kidnap you and forcibly wrap tefillin on you. But I'm also like, if my non-Jewish neighbor, right, if I call up my non-Jewish neighbor and I say, I'm on the way to Wegmans. You want me to pick up something for me? And they say, could you pick up, 2 pounds of pork chops? I don't have a problem with it, right? If, frankly, if Gail's son David asked me to pick him up 2 pounds of pork chops, notwithstanding the fact that he converted to Greek Orthodoxy, I could not do it, right? Because the halacha says that I could do it for his wife, but not for him, right? And but this is, look, Mordechai Kaplan, when he pointed out that American Jews live in 2 cultures, was absolutely correct, okay? Now, the problem is, so all of us, we live in 2 cultures. We live in the Jewish culture and we live in the American culture, and that's fine, right? You have Jews in Brooklyn who basically don't live in the American culture, right? And you have, unfortunately, a lot of Jews who don't live in the Jewish culture, right? And they may halachically be Jewish, but they don't live in the Jewish culture. But everybody that I'm looking at, we're bicultural, right? And that's a reality. That's simply a reality. And from my perspective, to try and change the sociological reality of American society, I don't get paid enough to do that. But that doesn't mean that there aren't issues sometimes where sociology and halakha are in contrast. And if that's the case, I am constrained, if only by the rules of my professional association, to give my primary loyalty to halakha, not sociology. Alan.
Lenny Bruce said that everybody in New York is Jewish, whether they're Jewish or not. And he said that nobody in Montana is Jewish, whether they're Jewish or not.
Except, and this is a great segue to close because it's now 9:20. You remember 2 years ago, I organized a group of rabbis to spend a week at the border. One of those rabbis, Ed Staffman, was just elected to the Montana legislature. So therefore Lenny Bruce was wrong. Okay, there are not only Jews in Montana, but there's a rabbi in the Montana legislature. All right, good night, everybody. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Yeah. Good night. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Rabbi, can I get a CLE certificate saying that I attended this and the halachic law, and that way I don't have to take any other courses?
Figure out what you want me to write, and if it's true, I'll sign it. Whether it works or not, it's not up to me.
Good night.
Good night.